Welcome to the 2023 GRESB Global Results Event for Infrastructure. I'm Reed Morgan, Member Relations Manager at GRESB in the Americas region. During this event, we will reflect on the state of the industry with perspectives of leaders around the world, learn about a new roadmap released by the GRESB Foundation, and review the achievements of GRESB participants reported in 2023. These insights represent just a small fraction of the information available from the 2023 GRESB assessments. You can explore the full 2023 global results on GRESB.com right now. Throughout this event, the GRESB team is available to answer questions in real time using the chat. But even better, you can also join us for one of the in-person regional insights events to ask questions and network with peers face-to-face. And you can find dates, locations, and registration information on our website. So, to set the stage here, I thought it might be interesting to take a quick look at some notable metrics that we observed this year in 2023. First, the global population reaching 8 billion people. The global economy growing over 5% to over $100 trillion. And seeing that allocation of that wealth distributed in the most asymmetric way ever, with 10% of the world's population owning 76% of that wealth. We're seeing atmospheric carbon at record highs, 420 ppm. We saw the hottest summer ever in Europe, 1.5 C above pre-industrial average. And we're seeing record lows for sea ice. But let's look at the other side of the equation too. Global Sustainability Fund assets hit nearly $3 trillion at the end of June. And our 2022 energy transition investment jumped over 30% this year. We're seeing records for wind generation, for battery charging, for solar generation. The unprecedented events of 2023 mean that sustainability has never been more important. We understand there is no way to achieve our Paris goals without infrastructure doing its part. And there's never been more scrutiny on our claims and our aspirations as an industry. There's also never been more potential for infrastructure to deliver benefits for people and the environment. So let's start the program by hearing from Davina Rooney, CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia.
Hi, I'm Davina Rooney, the Chief Executive Officer of the Green Building Council of Australia and the Deputy Chair of the World Green Building Council. I'm incredibly excited to be in this moment while we're leaning into what I'm calling the disorderly decade. Why? Because the best time to deal with climate change was about 30 years ago, but we're doing it all right now. What does that feel like? That feels like I'm sitting with my 12-year-old doing his term project that we were meant to do really steadily, but suddenly we're doing it all on the last night, not in the right order. And we're seeing that in the built environment right now. We're seeing leading standards suddenly fall behind regulations. We're seeing strong investor demand. We're seeing this everywhere, all at once, all at the same time. However, we need to lean into this moment because the world is listening and the time for change is absolutely now. I'm very excited to partner with GRESB in this moment because there's the chance of taking the alphabet soup and working with GRESB to work out what the ABC of that alphabet soup is and take this decade, work together to squeeze out every moment and drive the decarbonisation and broader sustainability agenda that's fundamental in this moment. I want to work together to design and partner on better operational and new buildings today so that we're in a better place for tomorrow.
Thank you, Davina. Now let's learn more about the state of the industry from GRESB's Christy Miller.
Thank you so much. Now, my name is Christy Miller, and I am a Director of Infrastructure for the Americas region. So welcome, Shama Nakwashbandi and Ainsley Simpson. So Shama is actually a portfolio manager at INCO, part of the value creation asset management that sits within infrastructure and renewable resources. Ainsley is actually the CEO of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. So thank you so much for joining.
Our pleasure.
Good to be here. So I know we have a few topics we want to talk about today. The first one was pretty broad, but what do you see the issues that are shaping infrastructure and that industry in 2023?
Happy to take a crack at that. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Christy, for the opportunity to be here. I think it's been a really interesting 2023. We've seen the increasing formalization of sustainability through the progression of various global standards and reporting frameworks. And if I may, I'll touch on some of those. So I think in June earlier this year, the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISB, published two disclosure requirements, IFRS 1 and 2, which provide a global baseline on sustainability disclosure standards, and in particular, prioritize the disclosure of certain climate related information. And while adoption is currently voluntary and individual jurisdictions have yet to decide on how best to adopt these standards, I think it's expected that companies will start building internal awareness and capacity to align their reporting practices with these standards. And I think while it's not a panacea, this is clearly a step in the right direction for convergence of the alphabet soup of ESG. These standards are essentially the market's best efforts to offer companies a clear framework as to what is expected in terms of sustainability disclosure, so that investors can benefit from standardized, consistent, and comparable data, which translates to better decision making and ultimately greater progress towards achieving global sustainability goals. And, twinned with that, in September of this year, we also saw the launch of the final task force on nature related financial disclosures, the TNFD recommendations. The TNFD is modeled after the task force on climate related financial disclosures. It incorporates the very same four conceptual pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And we expect these recommendations to encourage greater investor action on nature loss and the integration of nature into financial systems, with the hope of ultimately scaling up nature-based solutions. And I'd just say, lastly, one of the other areas of interest is that we're seeing an increasing scrutiny and attention on human rights, labor, and worker safety in supply chains. So in Canada, we have the upcoming Bill S211, which is currently awaiting royal assent. But once passed, that act will essentially require government institutions and certain other entities to report annually on steps taken to prevent and reduce the risk that forced labor or child labor is used at any step in Canadian supply chains. So in short, we're seeing stakeholders demanding greater accountability and transparency in ensuring responsible supply chains, leading to increased due diligence and monitoring efforts by companies to drive transparency and ensure ethical business practices. And I think all of these reporting and regulatory changes are examples reflecting the growing focus on sustainability.
Shatna, I would build on that. And Christy, thanks so much for the invitation. Today, I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Australia. And I'm absolutely say that those global shifts have shaped the sector in 2023. The other thing that we are increasingly observing is that those shifts are creating quite a significant gap or obvious hole in our capability globally. And from the boardroom to the graduate pool, there seems to be a much greater level of investment in a base of at least core set of skills and knowledge to navigate these imminent global reporting standards, as well as all of the variety of local and policy regulatory reform that is happening, like you mentioned, in Canada, that is tending to happen and match each country's trajectory as they move closer to interim targets for net zero in 2030. But we're also at an interesting time where in 7 years since the announcement of the Sustainable Development Goals and 7 years to go before we need to achieve many of those, I think there is much greater focus on progress as opposed to getting the perfect valuation and the perfect scores and the perfect metrics, which is quite useful. The last thing that's going to shape 2023 is likely to be COP28. Hopefully this COP doesn't focus on trying to undo what has been agreed in the past and instead sees a much greater focus on resilience through adaptation, which is really critical for infrastructure as a backbone of services and a way of life for most. I think the economic multipliers of infrastructure and net zero as a driver, it's likely to see that we'll see a much greater focus on equitable transition, more inclusive growth. And I do hope a focus on more good, less harm, but at the same time, massive tangible process and more shared accountability for loss and damage.
Absolutely. Those were wonderful answers. Thank you so much. And it is interesting. I mean, there are a number of standards and legislation. There's a lot of guidance. And now we have, you mentioned COP28. Feels like we're coming at this from a number of different directions. Within the infrastructure industry, I know a lot of what we talked about and what you mentioned was general. Some of it was specific to infrastructure as well. Can we talk a little bit more about the unique demands that sustainability and infrastructure present? The material issues in infrastructure, I find, are just so different than other issues in other industries. And even within infrastructure, it seems like a lot of times you have different sectors, right, with different demands.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, infrastructure is not a homogenous asset class. And I think, in fact, the definition of infrastructure continues to evolve and expand. Within infrastructure, you have multiple sectors, subsectors. And so the materiality of ESG factors really varies across sector, region, company, stage of development, and so forth. And all this means it's not easy to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to managing relevant ESG risks and opportunities. It really demands a much more nuanced, tailored approach, accounting for a particular asset-specific physical and operational complexity. That said, one area of, I think, widespread relevance that we're seeing across the spectrum is, of course, climate change and the impact of energy transition. And I think, firstly, obviously, significant investment in infrastructure is required to support the transition to a low carbon economy, whether that's upgrading existing infrastructure and improving energy efficiencies or investing in new infrastructure. Secondly, I think due to infrastructure assets typically having long life cycles, they often span several decades, high upfront costs, and limited flexibility. Infrastructure assets tend to be particularly exposed to the impact of climate change. So whether that's physical climate risk and or transition risks, climate change mitigation, resilience, and adaptation are going to be key. And as I think was touched on a bit earlier, there's going to be a real focus on embedding climate resilience at the outset of future-proofing and ensuring sustainable infrastructure across the long-term asset life cycle. And for this reason, I think there's actually going to be a premium on companies that are adopting active management and value creation activities by incorporating climate-related strategy and risk management into their business plans and building climate resilience to address climate concerns. And I think, of course, there are many, many challenges. We've come across those in our own context, but, identifying physical climate risk for linear infrastructure like power transmission lines or midstream pipelines is challenging. The very nature of extreme weather events that can impact physical assets across geographies just defies traditional risk management approaches. And secondly, obviously, decarbonization is a highly capital intensive process. And in a high interest, stubborn inflation environment with rising costs and increasing pressures from externalities, we're also seeing shifts in capital availability. And then finally, the other aspect I would just touch on is that for large scale regulated infrastructure, such as utilities, there are also really important affordability considerations. Since utilities must, of course, ensure that the cost of services be reasonable for the end user. And when you have investments in climate mitigation and resilience, that can potentially result in so there is a real need to balance affordable service with the imperative to address climate change.
I would echo all of those points, Shama. From infrastructure's uniqueness is really the enduring life of the assets that are within portfolios that provide services. So we've got these these assets with very long lives, coupled with the fact that there are long investment cycles and equally long decision-making cycles. And that does make embedding sustainability in the early stages absolutely critical. During business cases and bankability stages, it is important, which you mentioned. When you think that 70% of emissions are enabled by infrastructure here in Australia, but it's a similar proportion globally, those investment decisions that are being made today will lock in emissions which will be with us 50 to 100 years. So starting early enables that impact to be determined. We can profile the carbon emissions. We can set acceptable ranges ahead of design where there are then increasing diminishing returns. So wholeheartedly agree that the uniqueness of infrastructure is often in its life. The other thing about infrastructure is that infrastructure has a very clear purpose, and its purpose is around people. The purpose of infrastructure is to enable people to thrive. And while assets are often considered at a portfolio level, each asset delivers value for a unique set of stakeholders. And each of those stakeholders' values benefit differently. So measuring social outcomes and well-being in particular are specific to beneficiaries. Having broad frameworks in place with benchmarks allows value to actually be agreed with the stakeholders within the context that they work in. And place-based focus is becoming more and more relevant, particularly in energy. With all the transition infrastructure that we have, communities and stakeholders that hadn't been as affected by infrastructure are now being consulted and engaged and partnered with so that we can decide what value is in the eyes of those beneficiaries before it can be assured and aggregated and amplified, all the while recognizing that there are affordability issues that we need to balance as well. The last thing that I would say about infrastructure and its uniqueness is that it has a highly catalytic role in economies. And as a result of that, it's often quite political in almost every country the world over. And while we can't take the politics out of infrastructure, we can put sustainability and ESG into infrastructure governance. And I think that the role of infrastructure in having third-party assured ESG frameworks in play is quite critical because most of the frameworks are robust and consider whole-of-life impact. And that forces consideration of outcomes which extend beyond board terms or political terms, and then provides transparency and credibility in a world where greenwashing is now a widely accepted business risk. So I think that there's some very unique things about infrastructure that do make it fairly complex, but approaching things in a more integrated way will help advance all of the work that we need to do into the future.
Thank you both so much. I feel like this conversation could last all night. So I know we're actually over time. I am tempted to ask you if you have a top priority for the next year that you see in infrastructure, and then I think we'll pass it on to the next conversation.
So from my perspective, I think with the increased focus on regulation and reporting, I think ultimately the hope is to be more data driven. We see data as an asset, and this is where GRESB clearly plays an important role. Ultimately what gets measured gets managed. But I think while it's good that we're being held to a higher account, it's also important to think about how we're using that data. It's not just that a particular investment has X amount of carbon, but really what does that mean for that company and how are we managing our investments to best position them in relation to relevant ESG risks and opportunities? Does the data mean developing more meaningful decarbonisation goals? How does it shift our approach in engaging and actively managing our companies and portfolios? So I think ultimately improved data and disclosure should drive better insights, leading to improved investment decision-making and more effective allocation of capital, which should ultimately translate to better global outcomes. So I'm looking forward to seeing more data being leveraged and insightful ways to drive better decision making.
Dama, I think you've nailed it in terms of the focus. The only thing I would add is that by having all of that data, will drive a far more integrated approach to viewing ESG. It's not just about the E or the S or the G. When we consider the impact that infrastructure is there to enable, to enable people to thrive, when we think about all of those elements in their integrated way and the way in which they actually play out, we can't have a microscope on one. We need to have both the short term and the long range focus, because when you are thinking about those multiple perspectives, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think the hope is that, instead of focusing on ESG considerations, it's just become standard practice, and ESG issues are assessed like any other opportunities. I think that's the ultimate aspiration.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Christy. Very interesting stuff. Now let me hand it over to Sarah to discuss what's going on in the foundation and the roadmap.
Hello and happy Global Results Day. My name is Sarah Welton and I am the director of the GRESB Foundation. I'm going to give you a short overview of our hot off the press but low VOC Foundation 2024 roadmap. And I'm also going to highlight some of the changes you can expect in the 2024 GRESB standards. It's hard to believe we get to have this much fun on a Tuesday. I'll start with the foundation. I had drinks with a dear friend the other day and a fellow GRESB participant, and he said, so who the heck is managing the GRESB Foundation? He's a New Yorker, so he used a little bit more colorful language than that, but I digress. His question made me think it may be helpful to give a brief overview of the foundation and how my team supports its governance of the standards. So as a reminder, the GRESB Foundation is an independent, mission-based nonprofit organization dedicated to owning and evolving the GRESB standards. Its mission is to support effective communication between institutional investors and managers, empowering them with timely, relevant, and high-quality information to help drive sustainable improvements in the management and operations of real asset companies. The result is better, more valuable companies and assets that benefit people and the environment. The foundation advances the standards through a hierarchy of advisory groups, including the foundation board, the real estate and infrastructure standards committees, and expert resource groups. These elected and active members spend countless hours reviewing and evaluating improvements to the standards, which ultimately are approved by the foundation board. Chris, Roxana, Charles, Joss, Eric, and I help ensure these critical volunteers are supported throughout the annual review process. You'll receive a link to the 2024 roadmap in a post-event email. In it, you can read more about the foundation's mission and vision, learn more about its near and long-term priorities for the standards, and also find more ways to engage with us. This year, changes to the 2024 infrastructure standards include introducing a full new assessment for assets in the development phase, which will ultimately affect the fund level report. Providing the ability to report data coverage levels for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and offer more points to participants that report full data coverage for scopes 1 and 2. Providing the ability for participants to describe the methodology, either market-based or location-based, to determine material scope 3 emissions. And finally, providing an impact assessment of climate-related opportunities and introducing a score for the existing scenario analysis indicators. It's also worth noting that there's ongoing research around the topics of biodiversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and supply chain management. The full list of changes will be shared in a post-event email. Finally, I want to close with a big thank you to the Foundation Board, the Standards Committees, working groups, and expert resource groups. These volunteer members are the lifeblood of the Foundation, and they ensure the GRESB standards remain independent, mission-driven, investor-led, and reflective of the real asset industry and its members. I also want to thank all of you, our invaluable GRESB stakeholders. Your engagement is what makes the standards work. Your participation and support are what drive sustainable market transformation. Sincerely, thank you.
Many thanks, Sarah, for that comprehensive overview. And whilst the Foundation has been working hard on plans for the future, so have all of you who've participated in this year's GRESB Infrastructure Benchmark. And that is exactly what we're here to discuss today. I'm David Thomas, Director of Infrastructure Engagement here at GRESB, based in the EMEA region in London. And I'm joined today by my regional colleagues, Dan Winters in Americas and Karthik Javan in APAC. And between us, we're going to get stuck into some of that 2023 infrastructure result data and try to help to make some sense of some of the key trends. Karthik, Dan, welcome.
Thanks, David.
So to kick off with the top line global numbers, here we can see that the infrastructure benchmark now includes 172 funds and 687 assets across 72 countries. Looking at the participation numbers, we've seen the number of both fund and asset assessments continue to grow, and that's supported by the number of individual facilities, jumping up 15% in comparison to 2022. So let's spend a few minutes taking a bit of a closer look at some of that regional growth, starting with the Americas perhaps, and with Dan, where we've seen some really encouraging uplift in participation. What's the view from over there, Dan?
David, thanks for having me on this. You know, when I look back, total infrastructure assets held by the 100 largest institutional investors, which are tracked by IPE Real Assets, those have doubled over the past 6 years, 360 billion to 722. This growth in investor AUM mirrors the GRESB experience. GRESB has doubled from a solid base in 2018. We can see that here. And the growth in Americas during a pandemic has come from 3 areas: renewables, made up of solar and wind, data center and fiber optic networks, toll roads, and road networks. That's the big story here, with more to come when it comes to the fiscal stimulus that's happening in Americas. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think from an EMEA perspective, we've got some similar sort of sector differences as well. So it's interesting to note, I think, this year that renewable power assets have now leapfrogged transportation as the largest contributing sector in the EMEA asset benchmark. And from an EMEA fund perspective, the diversified and renewable power funds are now making up the vast majority of the benchmark. Obviously, in EMEA, we also have that country level diversity as well. So, we continue to see UK assets leading the way in terms of participation, followed closely by Netherlands, France, and Italy and Germany, all quite a similar group. Karthik, how about your views from APAC?
Look, with APAC, specifically Asia and Oceania, we do see the trend continuing, and it's not just for the region, it's pervasive globally. Now, what I'd like to really do is maybe focus on what's happening in APAC right now. Right? As we know, APAC has been, mostly Asia, has been playing a catch-up with regards to understanding the global ESG landscape, right? It's an alphabet soup of acronyms. What we help them to do is really to iron out and identify what are the more intrinsic factors for reporting on your ESG dimensions. With that said, look, Asia, you really have seen certain asset classes that are really seeing a lot of investment inflows. These include network utilities, data centers, transport, renewable power. These are the asset classes where we do see large-scale ramp-up capacities, facilities coming on board to address not just local customers, but also customers globally. That's what's fueling the growth in APAC.
That's great. And I think sort of staying on this trend of participation and perhaps now looking forward, you'd have heard Sarah briefly mention the very exciting news about the launch of the Infrastructure Development Asset Assessment, which will be available from 2024. Now, what this really means, this new assessment will be suitable for any greenfield pre-operational infrastructure asset or for infrastructure companies that invest in greenfield assets. Now, for GRESB members, for all of you, this represents an opportunity to be able to report across the full asset lifecycle for the very first time. Karthik, perhaps I can just come back to you quickly, just to sort of take a look at what this really means in terms of the outlook for participation within the infrastructure benchmark.
I'm glad you asked this question. Now, the development asset assessment, this really opens up huge prospects, right? If you have a portfolio, any portfolio that has seen maybe a slump due to the COVID-related economic lull, we immediately see these assets coming, these greenfield assets, these pre-construction assets, the ability to start benchmarking. There may be a hiatus with regards to the construction phase. Now as we reach new construction phase milestones, project milestones prior to getting the project COD, this already gives participants the ability across their full portfolio, be it an asset manager or even a fund, to start benchmarking in GRESB. And this is particularly interesting for Asia, where typically, for example, renewable power and a greenfield asset takes anywhere between 6 to up to 18 months. Utility scale could take even longer, 3 years, but you can start benchmarking right now. So this is exciting news, David.
Here in Americas, it's a multi-country effort. So we're seeing a lot of growth happening in Colombia and Brazil, in the Latin American market. Those are typically development assets. So again, this is great news. U.S. mainland is well represented within the benchmark, but that fiscal stimulus, $3 trillion, will certainly drive a lot of development in 2024, 5, and 6. So that's something to look forward to. And ultimately, the Canadians are really doing a great job. They've got public-private partnerships, a lot of institutional investment on their book happens in infrastructure. So once again, great story.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we're very excited about it here. Can't wait to start talking to you about it once we get underway. So we're going to do a quick switch now and start focusing on data coverage. So the next slide coming up here actually maps the average data coverage across all aspects, including both the performance and the management components within the asset assessment. I think globally we can clearly see near perfect coverage levels across all of the qualitative aspects within the management component. However, I think the key insight here really is to be found in the performance component. So we're all, I think, reasonably familiar with the challenges of data collection and data management at the asset level, but this chart here really clearly exemplifies those positive signs of progress. In Europe, for instance, we've seen hugely encouraging leaps in data coverage across key aspects such as GHG emissions and biodiversity and habitat. Dan, what stood out for you in the Americas? And I suppose there's a secondary question to that. What do you think are the key drivers pushing up that data coverage curve?
Ultimately, ESG comes to life through metrics and KPIs. This is all about structured non-financial data, first and second order material issues that matter to institutional investors, managing risk, looking for opportunities for alpha returns. So here in Americas, it's been a look for metrics and having a framework that allows the structured comparison year on year on year. This was a new idea in institutional investing. We've been at it now for 14 years, doing a great job. The Americas market is rapidly maturing in the hunt for ESG metrics and organizing this data with new software and prop tech companies that are coming to life to move this into the capital markets. Great story here for sure.
And Karthik, how does that echo in APAC, in your region?
Look, if we were to split APAC between Asia and Oceania, it doesn't really resonate well, simply because across the region, we do see a lot of ESG aspects, such as waste, water, biodiversity, and habitat taking a preeminent importance this year. And the numbers don't lie. The numbers show that we've got nearly perfect data coverage, in Asia, focused mostly on the performance component. But what needs to improve, especially across Asia Pacific, is really understanding the certifications, the infrastructure-related certifications for the facilities, for the assets that can be recognized. And I think that would be the push moving forward to understand how else a particular facility, be it a data center, be it a renewable energy power plant, can perform better in terms of consolidating data across the geography, across different cities, across different states. There needs to be a centralized platform for them to be able to consolidate their data. And doing GRESB is really the first step to doing so and understanding the gap analysis.
Superb. Thank you very much. Let's get straight into the scoring analysis now. The next slide shown on your screens, you can see the score distribution between of the infrastructure asset assessment in both 2019 and then versus today. So we can clearly see a significant shift from bottom left to top right. That's what we're always after, detailing real improvement across the board. And this is obviously what we hope to see, and it tells us a positive story about the growing sophistication of the sector. I think something else to consider here, though, is the spread between that bottom end and the top end. If you take the 2019 results, for example, you'll notice that reporting entities are evenly spread across that score chart, illustrating a large disparity perhaps between the lower end and the higher end scores. Flick over to 2023, we can see that very clear grouped movement up into the top right-hand corner of the chart. And this shows us, how significant the overall GRESB infrastructure universe score increases have been within that benchmark across the 5-year period, at both the management and the performance component level. Dan, perhaps you could give us a quick bit of insight into, what the key difference is, really between those middle participants in the middle of that chart and the ones pushing up into the top right-hand corner.
David, I love this chart. Right, in the Americas region, there's kind of two different groups. The first group was a coalition of the willing and the curious, and that's what showed up in 2019. And you see a normal distribution. Some organizations doing a great job, other organizations just trying to find their sea legs. Moving over to 2023, this migration up and to the right, we saw it on the real estate assessment, we're seeing it in infrastructure. So the groups, it's a journey, 3 to 4 years, understand what you don't know, work on the metrics, accelerate your program. Then that's exactly what this data shows, with more infrastructure groups coming in at the lower end and getting ready to move to the upper right. It's a continuous cycle. It's perfectly shown in this graph.
Absolutely. And I think, as we've just seen, moving on to the next slide, we've many members have been working at improving their sustainability performance for a number of years. So using GRESB to highlight those areas to work on, building out strategy to address those weak points. However, improvements can be made relatively quickly as well, which we see on this score on the charts here. So this actually charts, we see the group of participants scores by the year they joined GRESB, and we see a clear evidence of really sharp, quick improvement. Karthik, I note specifically in Asia, we've seen an incredibly strong start from some of those, that first year cohort. Can you give us a little bit of analysis around that, please?
Certainly, David. Look, being here in Asia, it's that notion of being prepared before you take an assessment, you take an exam. You're pitting yourself against the globe in terms of a global benchmark. So we do see a lot of consultation happening with our participants across all the different asset classes. They want to understand, they want to drill down to the details of the assessment. And even first year participants, look, I'm glad to report that some of them are getting as high as 80s, high as 90s. And this really shows the commitment that they've taken for their asset class to consolidate their data, prepare well in advance. And I'd really like to summarize, and I'm glad that Dan brought this up. I'd really like to summarize your ESG roadmap in as little as 3 years, right? The first year is all about reporting, setting the baseline. By the second year, you want to see what is improved. So that's the monitoring year. And from the third year onwards, that's where you're gearing up to benchmark yourself against the globe. Thanks.
Yeah, I think from an EMEA perspective as well, when we look at the average 2023 first year participant score for infrastructure assets, that's leapt up to 76% from 68% in 2020. That's really significant stuff. I think, this links again to that increased data coverage and the improvements we're seeing coming through in the collection of asset level data. So whilst it remains a challenge for the industry, I think we can see here in black and white the positive knock-on effect that's having better data coverage on the performance scores of those first year entities. Now, finally, it's important that we take a few minutes to also speak about net zero. This year, GRESB has increased the granularity of information it collects on net zero, now encompassing net zero policies, commitments, targets, and I suppose most importantly, enabling the tracking of this data for the first time. In 2023, we've seen 60% of global infrastructure assets reporting a net zero policy, with Oceania and Europe leading the way with that, with about 65% of participants in both regions having a net zero policy in place. Dan, could we get some perspective from the Americas in terms of how that net zero landscape's developing?
Well, to start, the actions in Canada. Canada has a carbon price, $65 a ton in 2023, increasing every year, $15 more a ton. By 2030, it'll be 170. Pricing signals are powerful, and it moves people to action. Every Canadian asset manager is on notice. Deliver a decarbonization plan. Let's have that plan in place by 2024 for action as the decade advances. In the US, we're maturing quickly on net zero. We've had two federal stimulus acts that happened in 2021 and 2022, Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and of course the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. $3 trillion are now focused on this with carve-outs for renewable energy, targets, net zero action is happening for sure.
It's great to hear. Thank you very much. And I think that's probably about all the time we have today. Dan, Karthik, thank you very much for providing that key regional insights there. Many thanks, of course, to all of you for joining us. And please do remember that on top of what we've discussed today, obviously, you can dive into any of this analysis of the data yourselves on the GRESB website. And finally, if you haven't already, please do register to try and join us at one of our in-person regional results events, which will be co-hosted with our partners. Reid, back to you.
Thanks, David and team. It's really inspiring to see the continued progress of the global infrastructure industry. I'm also really excited to see the new development asset assessment take shape next year. Good things to come. We also know that we do need to do more. So next, we're going to hear from some of our leading infrastructure members who are driving progress within their organizations and find out what they're seeing in the industry.
Hi, I'm Neil Kravitz, the ARCA's head of ESG. ARCAS has been a member of GRESB since 2017, and I sit on the GRESB Infrastructure Standards Committee. ARCAS drives ESG progress using 4 key elements. Firstly, a dedicated ESG team. It's 5 people out of our total team of 65, and 3 of those are dedicated resources. It shows both clear intent and gives us the ability to execute. We also only take majority positions. Control of our investee companies means that ESG is at the top of the agenda. Thirdly, we have a whole of life cycle approach from the very first stages of origination, where our ESG team is involved, all the way through due diligence, asset management, reporting to investors, and ultimately exit. Lastly, we have a continuous improvement approach, and the engagement that comes from the annual GRESB assessment is critical to driving our interaction with investee companies to make changes and improve their approach. In terms of what I'm proud of in the space, firstly, the ARCAS bespoke ESG approach has turned even the most skeptical CEOs into ESG protagonists. Our approach to ESG has delivered commercial value and success, both at ARCAS, attracting ESG-themed investor capital, and at investee companies, where ESG initiatives we have implemented with them have given them access to cheaper, deeper green financing, help them win tenders and new business because they can now meet customers' ESG expectations and criteria, and generated significant savings in energy and CO2 emissions by bringing forward investment into new equipment. Lastly, in terms of broader industry progress, one area that I think needs progression and innovation is net zero, and in particular, turning the top-down commitments of many organizations into actual bottom-up built real decarbonization pathways. We need to recognize that this is long-term strategy commitment from companies, which will span multiple management team generations. And as a result, we need to upskill and get buy-in from investee companies for ownership of their own pathways if we're really going to tackle this issue.
Hello, my name is Holly Backhurst, and I'm the ESG manager at Ventian Energy. At Ventian, we generate renewable energy to secure the future of both people and the planet. But we know it's not just about what we do, it's also about how we do it. And this is set out in our ESG strategy. Our strategy sets out how we can operate sustainably to leave both society and the environment in a better place wherever possible. It includes environmental initiatives like working to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, social initiatives like creating value in our local communities. Of course, it's also about upholding strong corporate governance. We are very committed to turning our ambitions into action. And given the urgency of the global challenges that we collectively face, this is essential. We believe that the best way to drive progress is by increasing accountability. And we are working to ensure that our ESG internal procedures and reporting have the same level of rigor as our financial reporting. The aim is that rigorous monitoring of our progress will increase our accountability which will in turn accelerate action. Recently, we released a new net zero policy, which we are very proud of. We are concerned by the credibility gap that we see across net zero targets, meaning the common disconnect between targets and actionable roadmaps to achieve them. Our new net zero policy directly counters this approach. We are boldly transparent about the fact that we are not able to set a net zero target at present. But we are doing everything we can to contribute towards a net zero future, and we do intend to set a target at the earliest point possible. We know that the road to net zero is very challenging, and companies evolve constantly and unpredictably, meaning that looking 10, 20, 30 years into the future can seem almost impossibly hard. We are proud of our progress to date on greenhouse gas emissions, but we still have work to do to enable us to set a net zero target that we are truly confident we can achieve. On a related note, we are reassured to see that greenwashing is increasingly being recognised as a reputational and a compliance risk. And more organisations are taking steps to communicate more transparently and accurately about the realities of their sustainability journeys. We all have an important role to play by ensuring that we are not complicit in normalising greenwashing, and that we are converting our sustainability ambitions into concrete actions.
Hi, my name is Aaron Scott, and I'm the Head of Sustainable Transformation, Patrizia Infrastructure. At Patrizia, our mission is to build communities and sustainable futures. In line with that, we have three key focus areas. The first is our Smart Cities platform, where we invest into companies and technologies that can support inclusive, green, and efficient cities of the future. Our second focus area is our alternative energy platform, where we invest across Europe into alternative energy ecosystems. It can include EV charging stations, solar farms, energy from waste plants, and bio-LNG production and distribution, to name a few. And our last area of focus is around alternative energy and social infrastructure in APAC. So underlining all of these key focus areas is our commitment to decarbonisation, where I'm happy to announce in December 2022, we affirmed our commitment through the NZAM framework to the Paris Agreement terms. So when it comes to driving progress and improvements and real outcomes, as a highly active fund manager, we have developed our own in-house sustainability performance framework, which enables us to determine what good looks like for each of our assets and co-create with the investment teams and the management teams remediation projects which we can then clearly monitor and ensure are executed to deliver real outcomes. I should note that the GRESB framework and assessments is a valuable input to that framework for us because it challenges us on a year-on-year basis as the industry and framework develop. But what are we most proud of? I think we're proud of a couple of things. First is that we chose very early on to be a data-led sustainability program. That means we don't just talk about narrative, but we track ourselves on what progress and outcomes we're actually generating. The second is we are actually generating alternative energy through our portfolio companies, through our investments into energy from waste, bio-LNG and solar capabilities, to name. I think one more thing I'd highlight is that we are very proud of the way we contribute to local governments to help them green their services and to make their services more efficient for their community. And that relates to things such as the provision of more efficient public lighting, more efficient regional heating, better waste management capabilities, and better water utility management. And as to the things I'm watching out for going forward in our industry, I think as the regulatory dust settles, we'll start to see who really is generating outcomes. And I'm hoping, based on that transparency, we will see an uptick in competition amongst us who can generate more outcome, which should be in line with the expectations of regulators, but most importantly, of our investors. I think the last thing I'm watching out for is as other jurisdictions come online with their sustainability framework, how will that interoperate with what we're doing here? Thank you.
So we have clearly heard that sustainability has never been more important. We know there's no way to achieve our Paris goals without the infrastructure industry. There's never been more scrutiny on our claims and our aspirations as an industry, and there has never been more potential for infrastructure to deliver benefits for people and the environment. We also know that we are not done. We are only getting started. This is reflected in the fact that the journey to 2024 has already started. GRESB participants are reflecting on their performance, learning from their peers, and raising the bar for the year ahead. We appreciate you joining us for this global event, and we hope to see you in person soon. Thank you.